in 1754, and he never sailed again. 10 years, surveyor of tides and lay minister in Liverpool, as began to study. He studied Greek, he studied Hebrew, learned them all on his own. He began to read divinity. He began to meet people. He met George Whitefield. He went to so many George Whitefield's meetings, they called him the Little Whitefield. And Whitefield is where he took on the Spirit, took on the theology. Hindmarsh says by the early 1760s, Newton's theological formation was complete, and there would be few significant realignments of his beliefs afterwards. He was a 5-point Calvinist, close quote. So that's where he is theologically inside, just the same place Whitefield was. Became a pastor in Olney, 16 years, London, 27 years, never had any children of his own. Can't find a word about that in any biography. That seems so strange that nobody would talk about that. He adopted 2 of his nieces, and they raised them, and one of those nieces cared for him for the long years after his wife had died. So, here's my question now. What did this man's tough tenderness look like, or the tough roots? What were they of his habitual tenderness? So, I'm going to shift off of a summary of his life onto the habitual tenderness. So we began with an introduction. We looked at his life. Point number 3, Newton's habitual tenderness. I didn't make up the phrase. He used the phrase himself. He was writing a letter on the effects of faith, and he wrote this. He, believer, believes and feels his own weakness and unworthiness, and lives upon the grace and pardoning love of his Lord. This gives him an habitual tenderness and gentleness of spirit. So what I want to do is give you some snapshots. Persons and patterns. That's my outline. First some persons and then some patterns of tenderness. He was tender towards groups and he was tender towards individuals. The groups I have in mind are first perishing, lost people. Here's what he wrote. Whoever has tasted of the love of Christ and has known by his own experience the need and the worth of redemption, is enabled, yea, he is constrained to love his fellow creatures. He loves them at first sight. And if the providence of God commits a dispensation of the gospel and a care of souls to him, he will feel the warmest emotions of friendship and tenderness while he beseeches them by the tender mercies of God, and even while he warns them by his terrors. And the line in that quote that I strike under is, he loves them at first sight. It's one thing to get to know somebody and have your heart knit together through some endearing relationship. It's another thing to look at a person and at first sight to have your first response not be disgust or criticism or assessment, but love. Don't you want to be that way? Wow. If you're sitting here and don't want to change in that direction, you may be dismissed. Because you're not interested in what I'm about here. I want to be that way. Another group is children. We heard it already. The signature of the tenderness of Jesus is, suffer the little children to come to me. When he went to Olney Thursday afternoon, one of the first things he did was start children's meetings. 200 squirrely kids. And he'd have one stand up and read a text. And then he would teach them from the text. Children. Dissenters' kids, Church of England kids. He said, Ed, sometimes 269, he said, I suppose I have 200 that will constantly attend. Third group I have in mind is his two flocks, the Olney flock and the London St. Mary's flock. And oh, how he tenderly loved these flocks. They weren't big flocks. 70 people at the beginning in Olney, didn't get more than twice that size in 16 years. Most of the famous Puritans ministered to little churches. We read these guys, they feel like they're big names. They ministered to little churches all their lives. They just thought big thoughts about a great God. And some of them wrote them down. Most of them died unheard of, unheralded, and they're just as great. They just didn't happen to be passionate to write. Some did, some didn't. He said, the believer, he possessed, it was said of him, he possessed so much affection for his people and so much zeal for their best interests that the defect of his manner, he was not an effective preacher in terms of eloquence or demeanor, that the defect of his manner was of little consideration with his constant hearers. They just knew themselves so cared for and loved by this man. And then there were individuals. So those are the three groups, and now he touches tenderly individuals. And you can imagine who I'm going to mention first, and that is William Cowper. I gave a whole message on Cowper and talked a little bit about Newton, and now I give a whole message on Newton and talk a little bit about Cowper. Cowper is the mentally ill, famous English poet who came to Olney precisely to be under the care and interest of John Newton. And for 12 years they lived together. 5 months one time he was in the house, and 14 months another time he lived in the house when he could scarcely function on his own. Cowper never married and lived in that parish. One person, when they saw this, as well as other things in Newton's life, they said his house was an asylum for perplexed and afflicted people. Newton says of Cowper, for nearly 12 years we were seldom separated for 7 hours at a time when we were awake and at home. The first 6 passed daily admiring and aiming to imitate him. During the second 6, I walked pensively with him in the valley of the shadow of death. Now you got to feel what's behind this. On January, don't have the date, but January 1773, Cowper wrote, in the evening, God moves in a mysterious way His wonders to perform. He plants His footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm. The next morning, the darkness fell. He never went to church again till he died for 6 years. And for 6 of those 7 years, Newton cared for him. Newton was removed from Olney in 1779. He did Cowper's funeral in 1780. So virtually from the time the last darkness fell until he did his funeral, Cowper lived in the shadow of the church and never went there. He pointed to it. He said, you know the comfort. He's saying this to Newton, who visits him regularly. You know the comfort I have felt there, how I have seen the glory of the Lord in His house. Until I go there, I will not go anywhere else. And he never went again. He was as black as black could be.